At 58, Margaret Colby had $347 in her checking account, a 2004 Honda Civic with a cracked windshield, and a cardboard box containing the contents of her desk at Harlan Springs Medical Center, where she had worked in the billing department for 23 years. The box held 3 framed photographs, a ceramic mug shaped like a cat, and a small plant her co-worker Diana had given her on her last day. A jade succulent in a terracotta pot, the kind that asked almost nothing of you and still somehow managed to survive. 3 weeks before, on a Tuesday morning in March, her husband of 34 years had walked into the kitchen, poured a cup of coffee from the maker she had started for him, and told her he was leaving. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't say much of anything, just that he'd found someone else, someone younger, someone who understood him. He took 2 suitcases from the hall closet. He took the car that was registered in both their names, and he left her the house with a mortgage that would come due in 6 months, when the money they'd saved, not much to begin with, would be gone. The divorce attorney, a woman named Sharon Peltz with reading glasses on a beaded chain and a habit of clicking her pen against her front teeth, explained the settlement in a conference room on the 4th floor of a beige building that smelled of carpet cleaner and old paper. Margaret would keep the house. Gerald would keep his business pension. He managed warehousing logistics for a regional distributor. And she would receive what he called a nominal settlement, which turned out to be $48,000, paid in installments over 2 years. Her half of the equity in the house would be hers to live in, but the mortgage, property taxes, and years of deferred repairs were hers too. Sharon Peltz had explained this with a certain clinical softness, the way you might explain to someone that their test results came back positive. Margaret had nodded. She'd signed the papers with a pen from Sharon's desk that didn't quite work. The signature came out faint, as if she were already fading. The day the divorce was final, Margaret sat in her car in the parking lot of the courthouse and didn't turn the key for 40 minutes. A man in a suit walked past twice. The same woman in a wool coat and heels came out of the building, got into a silver sedan, and drove away. Margaret looked at her hands on the steering wheel. She looked at the jade plant on the passenger seat. Then she drove home and began the work of not thinking about anything at all. But on a Wednesday morning in early April, a letter arrived from a law office in Colton, a town Margaret had never heard of, about 70 miles northeast, in the hilly country where the land started to fold, and the interstate became 2-lane roads. The letter was addressed to Mrs. Margaret Colby. It carried the letterhead of Patterson and Associates, a firm that specialized in estate matters. The letter was dated 4 months prior, back in December, when Margaret's marriage was still technically intact, when she went to bed each night beside a man who was already planning to leave. The letter stated that Margaret was the beneficiary of the estate of one Harold Edwin Voss, who had passed away on November 18th of the previous year. Harold Voss, the letter explained, had been her husband Gerald's uncle, a brother of Gerald's late mother. Margaret had never met him. She didn't know Gerald had an uncle in Colton. She didn't know anything about him at all. The letter said there was property. A building. It sat on County Road 4, about 3 miles outside of Colton proper. The property had been held in a trust for decades. Harold had left instructions that it was to pass to Margaret upon his death, not to Gerald, but specifically to Margaret. There would be taxes, there would be paperwork, but the building was hers. Margaret read the letter 3 times. She sat at the kitchen table, the one where Gerald had told her everything was over, and held the paper steady with both hands. She picked up her phone to call Gerald, then set it down. She didn't know what question to ask. The drive to Colton took 90 minutes. The landscape changed gradually, the way these things do. The subdivisions giving way to fields, the fields to forest, the road narrowing from 4 lanes to 2. Margaret passed a closed-down Walmart, a Cracker Barrel with a full parking lot, an outlet mall that looked like a place people passed through but never stopped at. Route 9 became County Road 4. Huh. The trees thickened. She passed a handful of farmhouses, each one sitting farther back from the road than the last, as if retreating. The property announcement came via a mailbox. It was black with white lettering, the kind that had been there for decades. It read Voss in faded paint. Beyond it, a gravel drive curved through overgrown forsythia bushes, their yellow flowers past their bloom, going brown at the edges. Margaret turned in. The drive was about 100 yards long, and then the building appeared. It was a two-story structure built of red brick, probably from the 1930s or 1940s. The front had a bay window, now boarded over with plywood that had weathered to a soft gray. The door was painted forest green, though the paint was peeling at the bottom, revealing older layers. Cream, red, a very old black. Above the door, still visible in faded gold lettering on the brick, were the words Voss & Company Books. The windows on the second floor were intact but filmed with dust. A gutter hung loose on one corner, and there were shingles missing from the roof's eastern side. The brick itself was solid but stained with water damage, dark streaks running down like permanent tears. Margaret got out of her car and stood in the gravel. The day was cool and overcast. There was no traffic on the road. Somewhere behind the building she could hear the sound of water, a creek maybe, or a ravine. She could hear wind in the trees. She could hear the tick, tick, tick of her engine cooling. She walked to the front door and tried the knob. It was locked, but she could see through the gaps in the boarded-up bay window. Inside, shapes, tall shapes. Shelves, probably. The building was dark, but not entirely black. There was some light getting through somewhere in the back or upstairs. The realtor's key was in an envelope inside the legal documents. It took some jiggling, but the lock gave. The door opened inward with a soft creak. The smell hit her first. Old paper. Dust. Something faintly sweet, like vanilla or old leather. Underneath it all, something damp. A basement smell. A stone smell. The smell of a place that hadn't been properly ventilated in a very long time. Margaret stepped inside. The space was enormous. The interior walls had been removed, or else the building had been designed as one large room from the start. Bookshelves lined every wall from floor to ceiling, built in with careful carpentry. Dovetail joints at the corners, wooden pegs instead of nails. The shelves themselves were largely empty. Here and there, a book remained, a battered paperback, a leather-bound volume, a stack of National Geographic magazines from decades ago, their spines cracked and fading. The books that remained seemed almost accusatory, as if demanding to know where their companions had gone. There was a wooden counter along one wall, about 8 feet long, made from what looked like walnut. Behind it, pigeonholes for sorting mail or cataloging returns. To the right of the counter, a small brass bell sat on a shelf. To the left, a ledger lay open, its pages yellowed and curled. Margaret didn't approach it. Not yet. The floor was wood. Oak, she thought, though it was hard to tell under the dust and the scattered autumn leaves that had found their way in through gaps in the walls. Footprints crossed the floor, old ones, faded marks of someone walking from the door to the back, then back again. No one had walked here in months, maybe longer. In the back corner, a narrow staircase spiraled upward toward the second floor. The stairs were metal, painted black, with a simple iron banister. Margaret could see the landing above, and what looked like office spaces, a desk, filing cabinets, the frame of a window. She walked to the counter and looked down at the ledger. The entries were in handwriting, neat and careful. The dates ran from 1976 to 1998. There were names of customers, titles of books, prices, sometimes a dollar amount, sometimes trade or barter written in the margin. At the bottom of the last page, a notation. Last entry, November 3rd, 1998. Margaret turned back to the cover. There was no name, but there was a date embossed in gold. 1976. 22 years of records. Closed down probably shortly after 1998. That was 26 years ago. A quarter century that the building had been sitting here, untouched. The books slowly leaving, the dust accumulating, the weather slowly working at the brick and mortar. Margaret went back to her car and sat in the driver's seat with the door open. She had brought a sandwich, peanut butter on wheat bread, wrapped in foil, and a thermos of instant coffee made that morning. She ate slowly, looking at the building. It seemed impossible that this existed. It seemed impossible that Gerald had known about it and never mentioned it. It seemed impossible that his Uncle Harold had left her, Margaret, the woman his nephew was divorcing. A bookstore. She finished eating and walked back to the building. Inside, she moved more deliberately this time. She walked the perimeter, noting things. The electrical outlets were old two-prong style, probably not safe. The windows were single-pane, drafty. There were water stains on the ceiling in 2 places, dark patches where the roof had leaked. But the walls were plumb, the floor was solid, and the shelving, when she ran her hand along one of the units, was built to last. At the back of the main room, a doorway led to what had been a back office or storage area. There was a small desk, a chair, 2 filing cabinets, a bathroom with a pedestal sink and a toilet that still held water, though the bowl was stained and the seat was gone. A back door that opened onto what had probably been a loading area, now just overgrown with weeds and the skeleton of an old truck bed, rusted to the point of near invisibility. And then Margaret noticed something. It was the baseboard on the north wall, near the back office doorway. All of the baseboards in the building were the same, painted white, simple, typical of the 1940s construction. But this one section, about 4 feet long, looked different. The paint was slightly newer. The nails were different. And when Margaret knelt down and looked at it, she could see that it had been removed at some point and reinstalled. She pressed her fingers against it. The wood was solid. She pressed harder, running her hand along the length of it. At the far end, near the filing cabinets, she felt a slight give. Not much, just the smallest amount of flex, as if the board wasn't quite flush against the wall. Margaret stood up. Her knees were stiff from kneeling. She was breathing faster than she should be, for standing still in an empty building. She went back to her car and opened the trunk. There was a tire iron, a small toolbox that had belonged to Gerald, and a flashlight. She took the tire iron and came back inside. The end of the baseboard came away easier than she expected. It had been installed loosely, held in place by just a few nails, and whoever had put it there had done so with the expectation that someone would eventually want it out again. Behind the baseboard was an opening. The wall itself was not solid. It was a hollow space, maybe 6 inches deep, probably meant for wiring or plumbing, but inside that space Margaret could see something. A shape. Metal. Dark. She used the tire iron to pry the board further. 2 more nails came free with soft pops. The board swung away. Inside the wall cavity was a metal box. It was small, about the size of a shoebox, painted dark green, with a brass latch on the front. There was a label on top, handwritten, covered in dust. Margaret leaned closer. The handwriting was careful, old-fashioned. The label read, "For Margaret. Open when you need to know why." Margaret took the box out of the wall. It was heavier than she expected. She sat down on the floor right there, with the baseboard lying beside her, and her heart doing something complicated in her chest. The latch opened without resistance. Inside, carefully organized, were several items. A journal, leather-bound with 1976 stamped on the spine. A stack of envelopes tied with string, each one labeled with a date going back decades. And on top of everything, a sealed envelope with her name on it, Margaret, in that same careful handwriting. She opened that one first. The letter was written on plain paper, folded in thirds. Margaret unfolded it and read the handwriting she recognized from 1,000 notes Gerald had left around the house. His uncle's hand, she now understood, not Gerald's. The date was November 10th of the previous year, less than a week before Harold died. The letter read, "Dear Margaret, I hope you are having a good life. I never met you, though I heard about you many times from your mother-in-law and later from Gerald himself. By the time you read this, I will be gone. The doctors have given me a few months, but I suspect it will be less. I'm writing this letter so that you might understand what comes after. This building has been my life's work, though I suspect very few people know that. The bookstore was my first love, but it was never about the books. It was about the people who came to find them. I kept records of everything, who came, what they wanted, what I gave them. Not all transactions were monetary. Some people needed a place to sit for an hour and not be bothered. Some people needed to know that someone, somewhere, thought they mattered. I left this property to you instead of to Gerald because I believe you will understand what he never could, that some things are built to help people, not to profit from them. He is a good man, but he was never shaped by this place the way I was. Open the journal. Everything you need to know is there." With deep respect, Harold Edwin Voss. Margaret set the letter down in her lap. She picked it up and read it again. Then she sat very still, holding the letter in the box, while the light in the bookstore shifted and the dust motes that had been stirred up by her opening the baseboard began to settle again, floating through the beam of light that came through a crack in the boarded-up window. She didn't open the journal that day. Instead, she carefully put everything back in the metal box, carried it to her car, and drove home in the gathering dark. The letter on the seat beside her, Harold's words running through her mind like water through a wheel. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with the metal box in front of her, the journal beside it, unopened. At 3 in the morning, she made tea and held the cup without drinking it. At 4, she read Harold's letter again. At 5, she watched the sky lighten from black to gray to a pale blue that made the world look like it had never been seen before. When daylight was solid, she showered, dressed, and drove into Colton. The town was small, maybe 3,000 people, she guessed. There was a main street with a hardware store, a pharmacy, a diner, a post office, and a few shops that looked closed or closing. The trees were just beginning to leaf out, new green catching the morning light. It was a place where people had lived for a long time, where things moved slowly, where you could probably know everyone's business if you wanted to. Margaret parked in front of the hardware store. "Hickory Hardware," the sign read, in letters that had been there long enough to have faded to a soft tan. She sat in the car for a moment, gathering something she couldn't name. Then she got out and went inside. The store was deep and narrow, with aisles that seemed to stretch back forever. The smell was familiar, that particular combination of sawdust, machine oil, and metal that every hardware store smells like, regardless of where it is. An older man stood behind the counter, maybe in his 70s, with white hair and the kind of weathered skin that comes from spending time outdoors. He was reading a newspaper, and he looked up when the bell above the door chimed. "Morning," he said. Not a question, just an observation. "Good morning," Margaret said. She moved farther into the store, not quite ready to speak to him directly. She browsed the shelves, nails organized by size, hinges arranged by type, wood stain in every shade from honey to ebony. She picked up a jar of hinge lubricant and put it back down. She found herself at the counter without quite remembering the walk. The man watched her. He didn't seem impatient, just watchful. "I'm looking for someone who might have known Harold Voss," Margaret said. "I recently inherited a property of his, and I'm trying to understand what it was." The man's expression didn't change, But something shifted in him, a small settling, as if a name had confirmed something he'd been wondering about. "Harold passed," he said. It wasn't a question. "Last November," Margaret said. The man nodded slowly. He set down his newspaper and folded his hands on the counter. "I'm Tom Hickory," he said. "I owned this place for 42 years, knew Harold for most of that time. He came in here every week, regular as a clock, for supplies. Hinges mostly. Wood, paint, tools." "For the bookstore?" Margaret asked. Tom looked at her more carefully now, really looked at her. "You're Margaret," he said. It wasn't a guess. She didn't ask how he knew. Instead, she asked, "Did you know him well?" "As well as you can know a man who doesn't tell you much," Tom said. Harold was private, but he was good people. Fair. Kind, in a way that wasn't showy about it. Tom picked up a rag from under the counter and wiped his hands with it, though his hands were already clean. "I heard he left the property to you. People talk in a town this size." "I just found out," Margaret said. "A few days ago. I went out to the building and it's closed. It's been closed for a long time." 26 years, Tom said. "Maybe more. Harold shut it down in the late 90s. After that, he kept the building maintained, but he didn't reopen it. I always wondered if he was waiting for something. Or someone." Margaret felt something catch in her throat. "He left me a letter," she said. "He said the bookstore was about helping people, not making money. He said he kept records." Tom set down the rag and leaned against the counter. "That sounds like Harold. He had a system for everything. Meticulous. But he also had something else. A belief that if you helped someone when they needed it, they'd remember that, and maybe they'd pass it forward someday. Not right away, necessarily, but eventually." Tom looked at her directly. "You know what I think? I think Harold spent 50 years building something that wasn't supposed to make him rich. I think he spent it helping people who had nowhere else to go, and I think he kept it running right up until he couldn't anymore." "Why wouldn't he tell Gerald?" Margaret asked. "His nephew?" Tom considered this. "Gerald's a good man," he said carefully. "But he's built a different kind of life. Corporate. Logical. Harold understood that not everyone's wired the same way. Some people are meant to build things that last. Some people are meant to use things that were already built." Tom moved toward a back shelf and returned with a small can of lubricant, the same kind Margaret had picked up. "This is for the hinges. They'll squeak after sitting closed that long. You'll need it." "I can pay you," Margaret said. "No," Tom said. "Bring it back when you're done with it, or don't. Either way, it's yours." He placed the can in a paper bag and set it on the counter. "You need anything else, you come back. And Margaret, read the journal. Whatever Harold wanted you to know, it's probably in there." Margaret drove out to the bookstore that afternoon. She brought the can of lubricant, a thermos of coffee, and the leather-bound journal. She spent 2 hours carefully oiling the hinges on every window and door, watching the rust give way to smooth operation. She cleaned the dust from the shelves with an old rag she found in the back office. She swept the floor, moving slowly, uncovering decades of footprints and debris. When the light began to change, she sat down on the floor in the main room with her back against one of the shelves, the journal in her lap. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was younger here, more urgent, less careful than the letter she'd received. The date was January 15th, 1976. The entry read, "The shop opens tomorrow. I am terrified. Not of failure, I've made peace with that. But I'm terrified that I'll build something and no one will come, that I'll create a space and it will remain empty, that I'll spend my life waiting for people who never arrive." Margaret turned the pages slowly. The early entries were about the business, about Harold painting the shelves, building the counter, walking to the library 3 towns over, to buy the first collection of books at an estate sale. About the day the first customer came, an old woman looking for gardening books, who spent 3 hours browsing and left with 7 volumes and a cup of tea Harold had made her in the back office. But as the pages progressed, the nature of the journal entries changed. Harold stopped writing primarily about books and began writing about people. A young mother who came in asking for novels where the heroine survived. Harold set aside a shelf for her, stories of women who lived, who thrived, who made it through. He didn't charge her when she came back. He wrote in the journal, "She needed to know that happy endings existed. That cost is not the point." An old man who came in during winter, claiming to be looking for a biography, but really just needing a place that was warm and where no one would ask him to leave. Harold wrote, "I gave him a chair by the window and a book he'll pretend to read. The real gift is the permission to sit." A teenage girl who'd run away from home, who'd lived in her car for 3 months before wandering into the shop looking for anything by James Herriot. Harold had written, "She asked if she could work in exchange for a hot meal and a place to sleep in the back room for 1 week. I said yes. She's been here 14 days now. I don't know what her name is, but I know she's reading Wuthering Heights and making sense of something." That's enough. There were hundreds of entries spanning decades, small acts carefully documented. A man who couldn't afford books but came to read biographies of people who'd overcome what he was overcoming. A woman grieving a daughter who needed to see the daughter's favorite book was still being read by others. A veteran who needed to sit in silence without being judged for his silences. And then, in 1982, an entry that made Margaret stop. "Gerald came by today. He's home from college, visiting his mother before starting that job in the city. He walked through the shop for exactly 7 minutes and asked me why I was wasting my potential on a bookstore in the middle of nowhere. I tried to explain. I tried to tell him about the people, about what this place does for them. He didn't understand. He said I could be rich if I marketed correctly, if I expanded, if I thought bigger. I didn't know how to explain that I was already thinking as big as I needed to." He left angry. His mother apologized. "I told her nothing to apologize for. We're just different kinds of men." Margaret set the journal down and pressed her palms against her eyes. She sat like that for a long time, in the dust and silence of the empty bookstore, understanding finally why Harold had left the building to her and not to Gerald. Why, when Harold was dying, he'd thought of Margaret, a woman he'd never met, and decided that she, somehow, might understand. She slept that night in her car, parked in the gravel drive, the journal on the seat beside her. She woke at dawn and went back inside. She spent the morning continuing through the journal, page by page. The entries became sparser after the year 2000, sometimes months passing between them. Harold was getting older. The shop had closed. But he was still documenting things. People he'd helped before. Ways he could help now without the building. In 2010, there was an entry. "I'm 68 now. The doctor says I'm healthy. I could have another 20 years. I want to spend them finishing what I started. I want to fix the building up. I want it to be ready. I've been saving. I've been planning. I'm waiting for the right person." In 2014, "I know who she is. I've never met her, but Gerald mentioned her once, years ago. He said she was quiet. She was good with details. She didn't need much. I've set up a trust. I've written my will. When I'm gone, it will all go to her. I hope she understands. I hope she forgives me for the mystery of it all. But some things need to be discovered, not handed over. Some things only matter if you've earned them." Margaret closed the journal as the sun was reaching its peak. She walked to the back office, pulled open the filing cabinets, and began going through the documents inside. Property deeds, architectural plans for the building, bank statements showing deposits made regularly, consistently, year after year. Insurance policies. And at the very bottom of the bottom drawer, a manila envelope labeled, "For Margaret," after the journal. She opened it with shaking hands. Inside were photographs. Dozens of them, some black and white, some faded color. Harold standing in the bookstore, younger, with his arm around a woman who looked like she might be his wife. She had his chin, his way of standing. Harold at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for the bookstore's opening in 1976. Harold with the old woman who'd come looking for gardening books, both of them laughing. Harold with the young mother, showing her daughter a picture book. Harold with the teenage runaway, now grown, holding a baby. Harold, decades later in his 70s, in the same spot where the young woman had stood. But now the young woman was a middle-aged woman, and she was showing Harold her own teenage daughter the shelves he'd built. At the bottom of the envelope, a final letter. It was dated just 3 weeks before Harold died, and it was longer than the first. Margaret took it outside, sat on the front step of the bookstore, and opened it. "My dear Margaret, by now you've read the journal. You've seen the photographs. You've begun to understand what this place was, and perhaps what it could be again. I want to tell you the real story, the one I couldn't fit into the journal's small pages. I want to tell you about my wife, Eleanor. We opened the bookstore together in 1976. She was the dreamer, and I was the builder. She saw what books could do for people, and I saw how to make a space where that could happen. We were partners in every sense. We had no children. We didn't need them. The bookstore was our child. Eleanor died in 1998, right before we closed the shop. She had cancer. She went quickly, once it started, which was a mercy and a cruelty both. The last thing she said to me was that I should keep helping people, even after the shop was gone. I promised her I would. After she died, I couldn't bear to open the doors anymore. Every book on every shelf reminded me of her. But I couldn't sell the building either. It felt like a betrayal of everything she'd believed in. So I closed the doors and I kept the building maintained. And I waited. I waited for 36 years. I waited because I remembered something Eleanor had said early on, when we were still young and still building the shelves. She said, "The best gift isn't what you give someone while you're here. It's what you leave behind that keeps working after you're gone." I didn't fully understand her then, but I do now. I learned about you gradually, over the years. Gerald would mention you, how quiet you were, how you didn't complain, how you seemed to accept things as they came. He didn't mean it as a compliment, but it was one. He was building a life of striving. You were building a life of steadiness. Both are valid. But one of them is better suited to what Eleanor believed in. 3 years ago, when I was diagnosed, I began to have real conversations with myself about what would happen to this place after I was gone. I could sell it to a developer. I could let it sit empty. Or I could give it to someone who might understand that the best buildings are the ones that serve people rather than money. I give it to you, Margaret, not because you deserve it, not because you've earned it, but because I believe you are capable of loving it the way Eleanor and I did. I believe you are capable of understanding that this building is not a burden. It is a gift, both to you and from you to the world. There is money, not a fortune, but enough. There are 2 savings bonds in the safe behind the office desk. The combination is Eleanor's birthday, 4/17/47. There is a small inheritance, about $31,000, that I've left to you separately from the building. It's meant to help you fix the roof, repair the plumbing, stabilize the foundation. Whatever you need to make it livable and workable again. But here's the thing I want you to know, Margaret. The real inheritance isn't the money, it's the mission. It's the understanding that a space can be built for people rather than profit. It's the belief that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness are the most revolutionary. I don't know what you'll do with this building. Maybe you'll make it into a bookstore again. Maybe you'll make it into something else entirely. Maybe you'll use it as a community space, or a repair workshop, or a place where people can come to learn. I don't care what it becomes, as long as it becomes a place where people know they matter. I loved Eleanor every day of our marriage. Some of those days were hard. Some of them were beautiful. Some of them were just ordinary. But I loved her, and the way I loved her was by building what she believed in. I'm giving you the chance to do the same. Not for Eleanor, but for yourself, and for the people who will walk through that door someday and find that someone, somewhere, thought they mattered. I loved you every single day, Margaret, though I never met you. I loved the person you became, and I loved what you might become next. Live well. Build something true. Harold Margaret sat on the step for a very long time. The light shifted. The wind moved through the trees behind the building. She held the letter against her chest and let herself cry. Really cry, for the first time since Gerald had told her he was leaving. She cried for Harold, whom she'd never met but who had somehow seen her. She cried for Eleanor, who had believed that buildings could save people. She cried for Gerald, who had built a life so different from his uncle's that he couldn't understand why his uncle would leave everything to a stranger. And she cried for herself, for the woman at 58 who had been told she was worthless, who had been left with nothing, who had been brought to this place by a dead man's will, and found instead a reason to believe she might still matter. That evening, Margaret drove back to Harlan Springs and broke into her savings account to hire a contractor to assess the building. 2 days later, she came back to Colton and met Tom Hickory for coffee at the diner. She told him what she'd found. She told him what she wanted to do. Tom listened without interrupting. When she was done, he nodded slowly. "There's a plumber in town," he said. "Name of Rick Valdez, and an electrician, Danny Wu. Both of them knew Harold. Both of them helped him keep the place maintained over the years. You tell them what you need, and they'll do it right." "I can pay them," Margaret said. "They know that," Tom said. "They'll accept payment, but they'll also do a better job because it's Harold's place, because Eleanor's still in those walls somehow." A week later, as Margaret was at the bookstore beginning the first real repairs, a car pulled into the gravel drive. It was black, expensive, newer, a BMW with leather seats and a dealership smell that made Margaret feel something harden in her chest. The man who got out was in his late 50s, wearing a blazer and slacks that looked pressed. He had the kind of tan that comes from golf courses, and his hair was exactly the shade of expensive dye. He approached Margaret with the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Margaret," he said. "I'm David Brennan. I'm a real estate developer. I work with regional properties, and I've been following the status of this place. When I heard it had passed to you, I thought I should reach out." He extended a business card. It was embossed with his name in raised letters. "I'm not selling," Margaret said. She didn't take the card. "I understand," David said. His smile didn't change. "But I wanted to make sure you understood what you have here. The land alone is worth roughly $140,000 in today's market. The building, in its current condition, is honestly a liability. I'm prepared to offer you $165,000 for the property, as is. That's a generous number, given the structural issues." "The building isn't for sale," Margaret said. "Think about it," David said. He set the business card on the windowsill beside the door. "I'm not going anywhere. There are conversations happening about rezoning this road, retail development, mixed-use spaces. Properties that align with that vision are going to be valuable. Very valuable. But that window won't stay open forever. If you change your mind, call me. We can make this very easy for you." He drove away in a cloud of expensive cologne and threat. Margaret looked at the business card, then swept it away. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and she knew it. She sat in the front seat of her car and did something she hadn't done since before the divorce. She counted her money. The savings bonds would be $34,000. The inheritance from Harold would be $31,000. The settlement from Gerald would give her the first $24,000 in about 6 weeks. That was roughly $89,000 to fix a building that the developer said was a liability. Tom was right. David was right. She could sell. She could walk away. She could be safe. Margaret sat in the silence of the car and didn't decide anything at all. If you've made it this far into Margaret's story, hit subscribe. Because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. The letter came on a Tuesday in May, 3 weeks after David Brennan's visit. It was official looking, with a law firm's letterhead and a case number. The subject line read, "Motion to challenge estate settlement, Voss Property Trust." Margaret sat at her kitchen table and read it 3 times before the words made sense. Gerald's lawyer, a man named Stephen Kohler, was claiming that the estate settlement was improper, that Harold's will had been executed under duress or diminished capacity, that the property should have passed to Gerald as the closest blood relative, that they were filing a motion to reopen the estate and challenge the distribution. The hearing was scheduled for June 14th. So 30 days away. Margaret set the letter down and looked at her hands. They were dirty. She'd been working at the bookstore that morning, scrubbing old paint off the window frames. Her nails were broken. Her palms had calluses she didn't have before. She looked at those hands and tried to imagine them signing the papers to sell the building. Tried to imagine taking David Brennan's money and walking away. She couldn't do it, but she also couldn't afford not to. She drove out to the bookstore and sat in the main room, in the middle of the empty shelves, and did something she rarely did. She let herself feel afraid. Really afraid. The kind of fear that makes your ribs tight and your breathing shallow. Tom found her there. She hadn't called him, hadn't asked him to come. But somehow, on a Thursday afternoon about a week after the letter arrived, his truck pulled into the gravel drive and Tom got out with 2 cups of coffee from the diner, already knowing she would need one. "You got the letter?" he said. It wasn't a question. "How did you know?" "Because word travels in a small town," Tom said. "And because Stephen Kohler called me yesterday, asking questions about Harold's mental state in his final years. He was hoping I'd say something that would help Gerald's case." Tom handed her one of the coffees. "I told him that Harold was the clearest thinking man I've ever met, right up until the day he died. I told him that Harold knew exactly what he was doing. It doesn't matter what you told him," Margaret said. "They have a lawyer. They have Gerald's claim. They probably have money to fight this. I have..." She gestured around the empty bookstore. "I have this." "You have more than that," Tom said. He sat down on one of the wooden crates Margaret had been using as a work surface. "You have every person in this town who knew Harold. You have Rick and Danny who can testify about how meticulous Harold was about maintaining this building, how he talked about it like it mattered to him. You have the journal. That's a record of Harold's mind and intentions, written in his own hand. And you have this building itself. David Brennan told me it's a liability," Margaret said. "David Brennan is a vulture," Tom said flatly. "He saw a building and land that could be torn down and developed, and he wanted it. That's all he's ever seen. But what this building is, what it actually is, that's something he could never understand. And frankly, I don't think Gerald understands it either." "Gerald's my husband," Margaret said. Then she corrected herself. "My ex-husband." "That's right," Tom said. "And I'm not going to speak poorly of him because he's not a bad man. But he's a man who left you after 34 years. A man who didn't tell you about his uncle, didn't tell you about this building, didn't tell you about anything that might have mattered beyond the bottom line. And now he wants what Harold left to you because he thinks it's worth money. That's not about family. That's about ego." Margaret drank her coffee. It was still hot and good, and exactly what she needed. "The hearing is in 4 weeks," she said. "What do I do?" "First," Tom said, "you call a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but the right lawyer. There's a woman in Colton, Susan Price, who's been practicing here for 30 years. She's sharp, she knows the judges, and she cares about things that matter. I'll call her and tell her about you. She'll take your case." "I can't afford a lawyer," Margaret said. "You'll figure it out," Tom said. "Susan's reasonable, and if you can't pay her in money, you'll find another way. You're good at that kind of trade, I think." 2 days later, Margaret met Susan Price in a small office above the Colton Pharmacy. Susan was in her mid-60s, with gray hair cut short and practical, and she wore reading glasses on a beaded chain like the divorce lawyer had, though her manner was entirely different. Warmer, more patient, less clinical. She read the motion and the estate documents without expression. When she was done, she looked at Margaret over her glasses. "This is a nuisance filing," Susan said. "Kohler knows it doesn't have merit, but he's hoping to make it expensive enough that you'll settle. He's hoping you'll be tired, or scared, or just done with the whole thing." Susan set down the papers. "How much money do you have?" Margaret told her. "The bonds, the inheritance, the settlement, roughly $89,000 total. And you want to use that money to fix the building, not fight this case," Susan said. "Yes." "Then here's what we're going to do," Susan said. "You're going to let me handle the legal work. I'll take this case for a reduced rate, $50 an hour instead of my usual $200. I'll work as efficiently as I can. We'll probably spend between $3,000 and $5,000 on legal fees, depending on how far this goes. The rest of your money is yours to use on the building." "Why would you do that?" Margaret asked. Susan leaned back in her chair. "Because I knew Harold Voss," she said. "Not well. But I knew him. I know what he believed in. And I know that what he left you isn't something that should be taken away by lawyers and judges. It's something that should be protected." She picked up her glasses and looked at Margaret directly. "I'm going to win this case for you, Margaret. But I need you to trust me, and I need you to be prepared. The hearing is going to be uncomfortable. Kohler will try to make you look unstable, or naive, or incompetent. He'll try to paint Harold as emotionally unstable or mentally compromised. It's going to be unpleasant." "Okay," Margaret said. "Is it?" Susan asked. "Because you don't look like you think it's okay." Margaret felt something crack open in her chest. "I just want to fix the building," she said. "I just want to do what Harold wanted me to do. I don't want to fight about it." "I know," Susan said. "But sometimes you have to fight for the things that matter. And this matters. Not because of the money, because of what it means." That night, Margaret sat in her car in the parking lot of the motel where she'd been staying, a small place called the Colton Inn, with clean rooms and a manager who didn't ask questions. She was supposed to be in court in 31 days. She was supposed to convince a judge that a dead man's will should stand. She was supposed to prove that she deserved what Harold had left her, against the claim of his own blood relative. A knock on her car window made her jump. Outside in the parking lot stood a young woman, maybe 25, maybe younger. She had dark hair, worn in a braid, and she was holding a backpack that looked like it had traveled miles. She looked hungry. She looked tired. She looked like she had nowhere else to go. "I'm sorry to bother you," the young woman said through the window. "I'm looking for work. Day labor, anything really. I saw you were here for a while, and I thought you might know if there's anything in town. I can do anything. Cleaning, landscaping, repair work. It doesn't matter." Margaret rolled down the window. "What's your name?" "Lily," the young woman said. "You got a place to stay tonight?" "I was hoping to find work so I could afford a motel," Lily said. Margaret looked at this young woman standing in the parking lot with her backpack and her hunger and her uncertainty. And she saw herself. Not as she was now, but as she might have become if Gerald had left her 5 years younger and with fewer resources. She saw what fear looked like when it didn't have anywhere to hide. "Come on," Margaret said. She opened the car door. "You can stay at the motel tonight, my treat. Tomorrow you can come work at the bookstore with me. I can pay you $15 an hour, and you can stay at the motel as long as you need to, while we figure out your situation. Is that okay?" Lily's eyes filled with tears. "I don't even know you," she said. "No," Margaret agreed. "But I know what it's like to need someone to take a chance on you. So I'm taking one on you now. Come on." They drove together in Margaret's car back to the bookstore. Margaret showed Lily the building, showed her the scope of work that needed doing. Lily looked at the empty shelves, the water damage, the peeling paint, and something in her expression changed. "This is beautiful," Lily said. "Even like this, it's beautiful." "What was it?" "It was a bookstore," Margaret said. "It's going to be one again." "Can I help?" Lily asked. "That's the whole idea," Margaret said. Lily started work the next morning, and she was good at it. Careful, methodical, willing to work hard without complaining. She scraped paint from the window frames. She helped Margaret organize the storage area. She learned how to use the tools, how to read measurements, how to think about what a space needed. But what happened next was something Margaret hadn't anticipated. Rick Valdez, the plumber, came by on a Wednesday morning to assess the work that needed doing. He took one look at the bookstore, and his expression went soft. "I worked on this place with Harold," he said. "Back in the 80s and 90s. He was meticulous. Taught me half of what I know about taking care of old buildings, right." Rick pulled out his notebook. "Plumbing's going to need a full overhaul. The pipes are old cast iron, corroded in places. But I'll do it. And Margaret, I'm going to charge you cost plus 15%. That's the friends and family rate. Harold would do the same for me." Danny Wu, the electrician, showed up the next day. He spent 4 hours going through the building, checking the wiring, testing the outlets, documenting everything. When he was done, he sat down with Margaret in the main room. "This is going to need a complete rewire," he said. "New service, new panel, new everything. It's a big job, but I'll do it right, and I'll do it at cost. Harold fixed my daughter's hearing aid one time, just fixed it, didn't charge him anything, said it was important. I owe him more than this." A woman named Carolyn Marsh appeared on a Saturday afternoon with 3 volunteers from the garden center and 50 pounds of perennials. She didn't ask permission. She just started clearing the overgrown weeds from the front of the building and planting flowers. "Harold loved gardens," she said when Margaret came outside to investigate. "He gave me a book once about cottage gardens when I was going through a rough divorce. He said, 'Gardens are about putting beautiful things in a place that seems like it can't hold beauty anymore.' I've been thinking about this place since I heard you'd inherited it. It deserves flowers." An old man Margaret had never met came by with a truck full of lumber. Good lumber, expensive lumber. He left it in a pile by the back door with a note. "For the shelves. Harold loaned me money when I was starting out, and I never forgot it. Consider this the debt paid. Frank Wider." The transformation began slowly, then accelerated. By early June, with 2 weeks left before the hearing, the bookstore was emerging from its decades of abandonment. The roof had been patched, the electrical system was being rewired, the plumbing was coming in. Lily had worked through her exhaustion and found a kind of strength in the labor. And Margaret had stopped thinking about selling. She was thinking about opening. Susan Price called her on June 10th. "The hearing is Friday," she said. "I want to prepare you for what's going to happen. Kohler is going to argue that Harold had early-stage dementia in his final years. He's going to point to the fact that the property sat closed for decades. He's going to suggest that leaving it to a stranger was evidence of diminished capacity. I'm going to counter with your testimony, with the journal, and with character witnesses who knew Harold well. Who's testifying? Margaret asked. Tom Hickory is driving over from the hardware store, Susan said. Rick Valdez and Danny Wu, Carolyn Marsh from the garden center, and I'm going to ask you if you want anyone else who knew Harold, who can speak to his clarity of mind. What about the people he helped? Margaret asked. The people from the journal? There was a pause. That's an interesting question, Susan said. Do you have names? I have entries from the journal, Margaret said. I could try to find them. If we can locate any of them, and if they're willing, having them testify would be powerful, Susan said. Because what Kohler is missing, what he fundamentally doesn't understand, is that this wasn't about money. It was about purpose. If we can show that purpose, if we can show that Harold was thinking clearly about his legacy, about what matters, then we win. The hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. Margaret drove to Colton on Thursday evening and stayed in the motel again. She lay awake most of the night, going over her testimony in her head. What would she say? How would she explain that a dead man had seen something in her, something she didn't even see in herself? Friday morning came gray and cool. Susan had told her to dress plainly, nothing that looked like she was trying to impress anyone. Margaret wore a blue blouse and dark pants, and she pulled her hair back in a braid. She looked at herself in the motel mirror and hardly recognized the woman looking back. Tougher, leaner, more solid somehow. Tom picked her up at 8:15. He was wearing a button-down shirt and clean jeans, and he looked uncomfortable in the formality of it. You ready? He asked. No, Margaret said, but let's go anyway. The courthouse was a brick building from the 1920s, all arched windows and worn stone. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than Margaret had expected. Intimate, almost. Judge Patricia Harmon was on the bench, a woman in her 70s with silver hair and an expression that suggested she had seen a lot of human foolishness and had gotten tired of it a long time ago. Stephen Kohler was there with Gerald, who looked uncomfortable and angry in equal measure. He wouldn't meet Margaret's eyes. Susan had Margaret take the stand first. She asked her to explain how she'd discovered the inheritance, what was in the journal, why she believed Harold had been clear-minded and deliberate in his decision to leave her the property. Margaret spoke plainly. She talked about the letter, about the entries in the journal spanning decades. She talked about Harold's intentionality, the way he'd set up the trust, the way he'd written instructions for what would happen after his death. Kohler's cross-examination was clinical and pointed. He asked Margaret questions designed to make her sound naive. How well did she know Harold? Not at all. Had she ever met him? No. Had she influenced his will in any way? No. Wasn't it strange that a man would leave his property to a complete stranger? Margaret thought about how to answer this. Finally, she said, "It's strange to me now, but I understand it better now. He left it to someone who could understand what it meant. Not just as money, but as purpose." Kohler made a dismissive gesture. "So a dead man's charitable whims matter more than family obligation?" Susan stood up. "Objection. Assumes facts not in evidence." Judge Harmon nodded. Sustained. "Counsel, stick to questions, not statements." Then Tom testified. He talked about knowing Harold for 42 years, about the man's unwavering consistency, his clarity about what mattered. He talked about the weekly visits to the hardware store, the careful purchases of materials, the way Harold maintained the building even after it was closed to the public. "Did Harold ever seem confused?" Susan asked. "Did he ever seem like someone whose mind wasn't working clearly?" "Never," Tom said. "Harold was one of the clearest thinking men I've ever known. He had a plan. He was executing it. That doesn't sound like diminished capacity to me." Rick Valdez testified about the maintenance work, about how Harold had kept detailed records of everything that was done to the building. Danny Wu talked about Harold's electrical specifications, how they were ahead of their time in some ways, carefully thought out. Carolyn Marsh testified about the day Harold had given her the gardening book, about how specific and intentional his kindness was. "He didn't just hand me a book," she said. "He handed me exactly the right book at exactly the right moment." That's not something someone with a failing mind does. That's something someone with a very clear mind does. And then Susan did something Margaret hadn't expected. She said, "Your Honor, I have another witness, someone who may not have known Harold, but who knows what his legacy means." A man walked into the courtroom. He was probably in his 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes. He came forward and was sworn in. "Your name?" Susan asked. "Thomas Chen," the man said. "And your relationship to Harold Voss?" Thomas Chen looked at Margaret, then back at Susan. "I met Harold when I was 17 years old," he said. "I was living in my car. I didn't have anyone. My family had disowned me. I'd left home because of personal things I was dealing with. I was lost. I walked into the bookstore looking for a bathroom, and Harold let me use it, and then he asked if I was okay. I broke down and told him everything, and Harold, he let me work in the bookstore for the next 3 months. He paid me, gave me a place to sleep in the back room, and never asked for anything in return except that I take care of the books." Thomas Chen's voice steadied. "I left the bookstore after 3 months because I got a job doing landscaping. I moved on with my life. I went to community college. I became a landscape architect. I own a business now. I'm married. I have 2 kids. And none of that would have happened if Harold Voss hadn't believed in me when I had nothing to believe in about myself." "Did Harold ever speak to you about his will?" Susan asked. "No," Thomas Chen said. "I haven't seen him in 30 years. But I heard through the grapevine that he'd passed, and I heard that he'd left his property to a woman named Margaret Colby. And I needed to be here. I needed to stand up and say that Harold Voss was the clearest thinking man I've ever known. He was thinking about the future. He was thinking about what would last. He was thinking about people, not money. A man with diminished capacity doesn't do that. A man with a clear vision does." Margaret felt something shift in the room. The judge leaned back in her chair. Kohler looked uncertain for the first time. Susan called one more witness, a woman in her 60s who'd run away from her abusive husband back in 1984 and had spent 2 weeks in the back room of the bookstore while she figured out how to start over. She was now a therapist who specialized in domestic violence. She testified that Harold had saved her life, quite literally, by giving her a safe place to think. When she was done, there was a quality of silence in the courtroom that felt like verdict all by itself. Judge Harmon asked if there were any more witnesses. Susan said there weren't. Kohler declined to call further witnesses. The judge took a recess. An hour later, she came back with her ruling. "I've considered the evidence," Judge Harmon said. "The motion to challenge the estate is dismissed. The will of Harold Edwin Voss stands as written. The property passes to Margaret Colby as designated. Furthermore," the judge looked at Kohler over her glasses, "I'm going to recommend that any appeal of this ruling be reviewed by the Bar Association, because this case has the hallmarks of a filing designed to intimidate rather than to establish legitimate legal grounds." Dismissed. It was over. Margaret walked out of the courthouse with Tom beside her, and she stood on the steps in the cool June air. And she felt something that she hadn't felt in a long time. The feeling of being believed in, of being seen, of being right, not because she was perfect or worthy, but because what she was trying to do actually mattered. That evening, Margaret, Tom, Rick, Danny, Carolyn, and Lily gathered in the bookstore. The space had been transformed. The walls were freshly painted. The shelves stood solid and waiting. The floor had been carefully cleaned and sealed. There was still work to do. The upstairs office needed finishing. The back room needed shelving. But the bones were there. The promise was there. Margaret stood in the center of the main room and looked at the people who had made this possible. "I'm going to open this in 2 weeks," she said. "I'm going to call it Voss & Company Books again, and it's going to be what it was meant to be. A place where people can come and know that they matter. A place where someone built something to last." Lily stepped forward. "I want to work here," she said. "Officially, not just temporary. I want to be part of this." "Okay," Margaret said. "You're hired, and there's a room upstairs. If you need a place to stay, it's yours." 2 weeks later, on the first Saturday of July, the bookstore reopened. The opening was small, no grand event, no special promotion. Just the doors unlocked at 10 a.m., and the community came. Tom brought coffee from the diner. Carolyn brought flowers for the window display. Rick and Danny came with their families. Thomas Chen drove over from his office with his wife and kids, and his daughter picked out a stack of books. Adventure stories, fantasy, the kind of books that make you believe in possibility. Lily stood behind the refurbished counter. They'd found it in an antique shop in a nearby town, and it had belonged to another store. But it was the right size and the right feeling, and helped customers navigate the shelves. She had an apron on, a simple one that Margaret had embroidered with a small V for Voss. She had a name tag. She had a job. She had a place. And in the back room, in a spot of honor where customers couldn't miss it, Margaret hung a photograph of Harold and Eleanor, taken in 1985, standing in the middle of these same shelves. Harold had his arm around Eleanor, and they were both smiling with the quiet satisfaction of people who had built something true. On that first evening, after everyone had left, Margaret sat alone in the bookstore. The light was fading outside the windows. The shelves were mostly empty still, but they were waiting. The cash register, a vintage 1960s machine she'd found in an estate sale, sat silent on the counter. She went upstairs to the small office that had been Harold's, and she sat at the desk where he must have sat for years. She opened the drawer, and inside was a leather journal, new, unused. On the first page, in handwriting that matched Harold's from all those years ago, was a single sentence. For Margaret. Record what you see. Margaret picked up a pen from the desk and opened the journal to the first blank page. She didn't write about the hearing, or the business, or the difficulties that were sure to come. Instead, she wrote about the feeling of coming home to a place she'd never been before. She wrote about Lily, and about Tom's quiet faith. She wrote about Thomas Chen standing up in court and testifying about a man who'd changed his life without ever asking for credit. She wrote, "I don't know yet what this place will become, but I know that people will come through this door and find what they need. Maybe a book, maybe just a place to sit. Maybe just the knowledge that someone, somewhere, thinks they matter." She set down the pen and looked at the empty pages waiting to be filled. There was so much time ahead. So much work. So much possibility. Downstairs, she heard the bell above the front door chime softly. She went down to see who had come. It was a young man, maybe 19 or 20, with weathered clothes and a backpack. He looked uncertain, as if he wasn't sure whether places like this would welcome someone like him. "We're about to close," Margaret said gently. "But can I help you find something?" The young man looked around the space. "I was just driving through," he said. "I saw the light on. I've never been in a bookstore that wasn't a big chain. Is it? Can I look around?" "Of course," Margaret said. "Take your time." He browsed the shelves quietly while Margaret pretended to organize things, giving him privacy. After about 30 minutes, he picked out 3 books and came to the counter. 2 of them were about living off the grid, self-sufficiency. One was a novel about someone starting over in a small town. Margaret rang them up on the old cash register. The total came to $34. The young man counted out the money carefully, as if it meant something to make sure he had exactly enough. "You staying in town?" Margaret asked. "I don't know yet," the young man said. "I'm just kind of traveling, trying to figure things out." Margaret reached behind the counter and pulled out a sandwich she'd made earlier. Turkey and cheese on whole wheat, the same kind she'd eaten in her car 100 times. "Take this," she said, "on the house." The young man looked at the sandwich and his eyes went shiny. "Huh, why?" he asked. "Because you look like you might be hungry," Margaret said, "and because that's what this place is for." He took the sandwich with the kind of careful reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. "Thank you," he said. "I don't... Thank you." "What's your name?" Margaret asked. "James," he said. "James, if you need a place to stay tonight, there's a diner down the street, the Miller's Diner. Tell the owner, Diana, that I sent you. She'll find you a place. And if you want to come back tomorrow, we can talk about work." James left with his books and his sandwich, and Margaret locked up the bookstore. She turned off the lights except for the one in the front window, a warm yellow bulb that would glow out into the dark, saying to anyone who passed, "There is a place here. There is welcome here." She stood on the front step for a moment in the cool evening, looking at her name on the deed now, looking at the building that had sat empty for 30 years and was empty no longer. The brick was solid, the roof was sound, the windows were clean. And through those windows, you could see the shelves waiting to be filled, waiting for people to come and find what they needed. A story, a refuge, a reminder that somewhere in the world, there was someone who believed they mattered. Margaret walked home to the small apartment above the bookstore that she'd claimed for herself, the space where Eleanor and Harold had once lived, before the heartbreak, before the closed doors, before the decades of waiting. She climbed the narrow stairs to the bedroom at the front, where you could look out over the rooftop and see the road stretching away toward the highway, toward the world beyond. She set Harold's letter on the windowsill, beside the leather journal, and a framed photograph of Eleanor and Harold on their wedding day. She set down the small brass key that had been in the metal box, the key to the bookstore door, the key she'd used for months now, but which suddenly felt like it belonged in her hand. Outside, the night deepened. The road grew quiet. In the street below, the porch light caught the edge of the brass key and threw a small golden reflection across the wall. Margaret stood at the window and watched the world settle into darkness, the trees becoming shadow shapes, the few houses visible going dark one by one as people inside turned off their lights and got ready for sleep. "Thank you," she said aloud to the darkness, to Harold, to Eleanor, to the people who had helped her, to the young man named James who had walked in just before closing, looking for something, and finding, in the smallest moment of kindness, the belief that maybe he mattered too. She closed her eyes and listened to the night sounds. The wind in the trees behind the building, the distant sound of traffic on the highway, the creaks and settles of the old building as it cooled into evening. Here is what Margaret understood in that moment and what she would write in the journal the next morning. The things that last are not the things that make money. The things that last are the things that help people believe in themselves. The things that last are the spaces where broken people can find shelter, where lost people can find direction, where scared people can find hope. She opened her eyes to the dark reflection of herself in the window glass, not looking backward anymore, not looking at all the ways she'd been failed or forgotten, just looking at the woman she'd become in a bookstore in a small town, called here by a dead man's will, kept here by her own choice. The bell above the door downstairs would ring 1,000 times, she thought. 1,000 people would walk through that door looking for a book, or a place to sit, or just the small comfort of knowing someone had thought to leave the light on. And that would be enough. That would be more than enough.